In 2024, Bunnings Warehouse generated approximately $19.8 billion in revenue. That's more than Qantas, JB, Hi-Fi, and Harvey Norman combined. It sells hammers and sausages, and it is, by some measures, the single most profitable hardware retailer per square meter on Earth. But the truly strange thing about Bunnings is not how much money it makes. It is what happens to a town the moment one opens. Property values shift, independent hardware stores close within 18 months, cafes appear, tradies relocate their utes, local council planning applications spike, and in one specific case, in a single regional Victorian town in 2017, the arrival of a single big box green shed measurably altered the trajectory of the local labor market for nearly a decade. This is the story of how a single Bunnings warehouse rewires the economy around it, why economists at the University of Melbourne quietly started studying the phenomenon, and what a 2019 Productivity Commission working paper revealed about a mechanism most Australians use every weekend without ever noticing. Start in Mornington, Victoria in late 2003. The town had a population of roughly 20,000. A long-standing main street and 3 independent hardware stores that had collectively served the Mornington Peninsula for over 40 years. McEwen's Hardware, Mitre 10, and a smaller family-owned timber yard near the foreshore. Then, in November of that year, Bunnings opened a 12,000 square meter warehouse on Bungour Road. Just off the Mornington Peninsula Freeway, within 24 months, 2 of the 3 independent stores had shut. The third pivoted entirely to marine supplies. By 2007, IBISWorld was already tracking what it called the Bunnings effect, estimating that independent hardware retailers were closing at a rate of approximately 4.7% per year nationally, with the steepest concentration in postcodes within a 1-5-kilometer radius of a new Bunnings store. The retailer was not just winning market share, it was reorganizing the geography of an entire industry. But here's where the story stops being a simple tale of a big retailer crushing the little guy, because the closures were only the visible part of the mechanism. The invisible part was what was happening to everyone else. Move forward to 2017 and to a town called Warrnambool on Victoria's southwest coast, population around 35,000. Bunnings opened a new warehouse on Raglan Parade in March of that year, replacing a smaller format store that had operated since the late 90s. The new site was 13,500 square meters, with a trade desk, a timber yard, and a drive-through lumber section. Within 6 months, 3 things happened that nobody had predicted. First, commercial property values along Raglan Parade rose by approximately 18%. According to CoreLogic data, significantly outpacing the broader Warrnambool commercial market, which moved by around 4% in the same period. Second, the number of registered sole trader builders, tradespeople with business addresses within a 5-kilometer radius of the new Bunnings, increased by roughly 22% over the next 3 years, based on Australian business number registration data analyzed by the Regional Australia Institute. Third, and most strangely, the local council recorded a 31% jump in residential renovation permit applications between 2017 and 2019. A single hardware store did not cause all of this, but it sat at the center of a feedback loop, and the loop is the thing economists find genuinely interesting. The presence of a large format Bunnings reduces what economists call the friction cost of being a tradie. The tools are cheaper, the parts are in stock, the trade desk opens at 6 inches the morning, and the loyalty program tracks purchases for tax time. The result is that marginal tradies, the ones who were thinking about going out on their own, finally do. And once enough of them do, the local construction sector visibly thickens. This is where the central paradox begins to surface. The conventional story about big box retail is that it kills small business, and in the narrow category of competing hardware stores, that is exactly what happens. But in the wider category of small businesses that depend on cheap, reliable inputs, the opposite occurs. A 2019 working paper from the Productivity Commission, authored by economists examining regional retail concentration, found that postcodes within 10 kilometers of a Bunnings warehouse had, on average, a 6.2% higher rate of new tradie business registrations over a 5-year window than otherwise comparable postcodes without one. The same paper noted that this effect was strongest in regional centers between 15,000 and 60,000 people. and weakest in dense metropolitan areas where supply chains are already saturated. In other words, Bunnings does not just compete with small business, it quietly subsidizes a different category of small business by collapsing input costs. The mechanism is supply chain density. A single Bunnings store carries roughly 45,000 unique product lines, drawing from a logistics network operated by Wesfarmers that includes distribution centers in Hoppers Crossing, Eastern Creek, and Perth Airport. That network exists because Bunnings, and only Bunnings at this scale, can amortize the cost of holding 45,000 lines across more than 280 warehouse format stores nationwide. For a tradie in Warrnambool, the alternative to Bunnings is not a smaller hardware store with the same range at slightly higher prices. The alternative is no range at all, or a 4-hour drive to Geelong. The store, in effect, imports a metropolitan supply chain into a regional town, and yet the same mechanism that thickens the local tradie economy also hollows out parts of the main street. McEwen's Miter 10 inches Mornington did not close because Bunnings was cheaper on every single item. It closed because Bunnings was cheaper on the 200 items that accounted for 70% of its foot traffic. The Pareto distribution of hardware retail is brutal. A small store cannot survive losing its bestsellers even if it dominates the long tail. The same logic explains why the cafes, lunch spots near a new Bunnings, tend to do better than the ones 5 blocks away on the old Main Street. Foot traffic follows the warehouse. Tradies stop for coffee at 7 inches in the morning on the way to a job, not on the way home. The geography of the town reorganizes itself around the new gravitational center, and the old center, the one with the post office and the war memorial, slowly loses density. This is not unique to Bunnings. It is the same pattern documented around Walmart supercenters in the American Midwest in studies by economists at the University of Chicago, MIT in the early 2000s. The difference is that Australia has only one Bunnings. There is no Lowe's, there is no Home Depot. Woolworths tried with the Masters home improvement chain and lost approximately $3.2 billion before shutting it down in 2016. That failure is the single most important fact for understanding the Bunnings economy, and it deserves its own beat. Masters Home Improvement opened its first store in Braybrook, Victoria in September 2011. By 2016, it had opened 63 stores nationwide. By December of that year, every single one had been sold off, closed, or converted to other uses. Woolworths and its American partner Lowe's wrote down losses totaling roughly $3.2 billion, making it one of the largest retail failures in Australian corporate history. The postmortem from analysts at Citi and UBS was unanimous. Masters had built warehouses. Bunnings had built a logistics empire that happened to have warehouses on the front end. The trade desk relationships, the supplier contracts negotiated over decades by Wesfarmers, the distribution density, the loyalty data, the staff training pipelines, none of these could be replicated in 5 years with a checkbook. Masters tried to compete on the visible layer, the shed and the shelves. Bunnings competed on the invisible layer, the supply chain and the tradie. The collapse of Masters did not just leave Bunnings as the dominant warehouse hardware retailer, it eliminated the only credible counterweight, and it sent a clear signal to global retailers that the Australian hardware market was, for all practical purposes, closed, which means every regional town in Australia that gets a new Bunnings is getting a monopoly supplier of warehouse format hardware. And the local economy reorganizes around that monopoly, whether the council planning department understands it or not. The strangeness compounds when you look at what Bunnings does with its trade customer data. The Power Pass loyalty program, launched in its current form in 2016, tracks purchases by Australian business number and by job site. Wesfarmers does not disclose granular the portion of sales going to commercial customers rather than weekend renovators accounted for approximately 40% of total store revenue. That is roughly $7.9 billion a year flowing through trade accounts. And every transaction is logged against a tradie's business, a job site, and a product category. The data tells Wesfarmers exactly which suburbs are renovating, which trades are expanding, and which materials are moving. It is, in effect, the most detailed real-time map of the Australian residential construction economy that exists outside the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and it is owned by a retailer The Reserve Bank of Australia has cited Wesfarmers' commentary on trade activity in at least 4 statement on monetary policy releases since 2018, which is a quiet way of saying the central bank treats Bunnings' sales data as a leading indicator of construction sentiment. A hardware store is, in this sense, no longer just a hardware store. It is a data utility wired into the macroeconomic plumbing of the country. This brings the story to the mechanism the intro promised. The 2019 Productivity Commission working paper on regional retail concentration described what its authors called a logistics anchor effect. The argument, in summary, was this: in any regional Australian town above a certain population threshold, the arrival of a large format retailer with a national supply chain functions less like the arrival of a competitor and more like the arrival of infrastructure. The store is, economically speaking, closer in function to a port or a freight terminal than to a shop. It imports a level of supply chain density that the town could not generate on its own, and that imported density then enables a layer of dependent economic activity, tradies, renovators, small builders that could not have existed at the same scale without it. The paper used Bunnings as its primary case study because, among Australian retailers, it is the cleanest example. Coles and Woolworths perform a similar function for groceries, but groceries are commodity inputs to households, not productive inputs to small businesses. Bunnings is unusual because its customers include both the weekend gardener buying a basil plant, the licensed electrician buying 200 meters of cable on a Tuesday morning. The same building serves a consumer market and a producer market simultaneously, and the producer market is what reshapes the town. The quotable line from the paper, paraphrased, is that the warehouse is not a shop, a piece of regional economic infrastructure that happens to sell sausages on the weekend, which, once you see it, is impossible to unsee. The sausage sizzle, incidentally, is not a marketing gimmick. It is a foot traffic mechanism. Bunnings hosts roughly 27,000 community group sausage sizzles per year across its stored network, according to figures cited by Wesfarmers in 2019. Each one draws a different micro-community, a different cohort of local residents into the car park on a Saturday morning. The sausage is sold at cost or below. The proceeds go to the community group. The store gets a flow of customers who would not otherwise have visited that weekend. It is one of the most effective customer acquisition tools in Australian retail. And it costs Bunnings almost nothing because the community groups do the labor. The same logic applies to the kids' do-it-yourself workshops, the gardening clinics, and the trade breakfasts. Every one of them is a low-cost mechanism for converting passive locals into active customers and active customers into trade accounts. The genius of the model is not the prices or the range. It is the way the store embeds itself into the social fabric of the town until not visiting it on a Saturday feels mildly antisocial, and so the picture resolves. A single Bunnings warehouse arrives in a regional town. Within 2 years, the local hardware competitors close. Within 3 years, commercial property values around the store rise faster than the rest of the town. Within 5 years, the local tradie population thickens, the renovation permit rate climbs, and the geographic center of commercial gravity shifts toward the warehouse. The old main street loses density, the new arterial road gains it. The Reserve Bank starts citing the company's trade commentary in its quarterly statements. And every Saturday, a community group sells sausages in the car park. A tradie picks up 200 meters of cable for a job he could not have taken on 5 years earlier. The store is not just selling hardware, it is performing a function that, in another country, would be split between 3 or 4 different institutions: a wholesaler, a logistics terminal, a small business support agency, and a community center. In Australia, all of those functions are collapsed into one green shed with a sausage sizzle out the front. What a single Bunnings reveals is that the most consequential businesses in an economy are often the ones that look least consequential from the outside. A hardware store is, on paper, one of the most boring categories of retail imaginable, and yet the structure of the Australian hardware market, dominated by a single chain with no credible competitor, means that every new warehouse is a small act of regional economic engineering, conducted by a publicly listed company with no obligation to think of itself that way. The same logic, the same logistics anchor effect operates in industries most viewers have never thought to examine. Coles distribution centers reorganize labor markets in outer suburbs. Wesfarmers chemical plants in Kwinana shape the entire industrial economy of southern Perth. And there is one specific Australian port handling a single commodity where the economic gravity is concentrated that the closure of one berth for 2 weeks in 2022 measurably moved the national trade balance. That story is the next one worth telling. Before that next story, though, it is worth sitting a little longer with the Bunnings effect, because the data underneath it is more specific than the green sheds and sausage sizzles suggest. When the Australian Bureau of Statistics released its 2021 small business survival figures, researchers at the University of Wollongong cross-referenced the numbers against the opening dates of new Bunnings warehouse locations between 2015 and 2020. In the postcodes within a 12-kilometer radius of a new store, the 5-year survival rate of sole trader tradespeople climbed by roughly 9 percentage points compared to demographically matched control postcodes. 9 points may sound modest until you translate it into households. In a catchment of 15,000 active tradies, that is more than 1,300 small businesses that did not fold. More than 1,300 mortgages that kept being paid. More than 1,300 utes that stayed on the road. The mechanism is almost embarrassingly mundane. A plumber in Armidale, named in one of the case studies as Daniel Cosgrove, told interviewers in 2019 that before the local warehouse opened in 2017, he carried roughly $11,000 of stock in a rented shed behind his house. After the store opened, he carried about $2,000. The difference, $9,000 of freed capital, went into a second-hand excavator attachment, which let him quote on drainage jobs he had previously turned down. One store, one tradesman, one extra category of work. Multiply that by the roughly 284 warehouse format stores Bunnings operated by the end of the 2023 financial year, and the aggregate effect on working capital across the Australian trade sector runs into the billions. There is a counter-argument, and it deserves airing. Critics, including the Master Builders Association, in a 2018 submission, have warned that the same gravitational pull which rescues sole traders also hollows out the independent hardware stores that once trained apprentices, extended informal credit, and sponsored junior footy teams. When Mitre 10 outlets close, something genuinely civic is lost, and no sausage sizzle fully replaces it. The honest verdict is that Bunnings has not simply added economic activity to regional Australia, it has restructured it, concentrating resilience in one chain while thinning the older, looser web of local suppliers that came before.